button?
I just did.
All right, thanks. So this is the keynote talk for the workshop on ontology design and patterns 2020 at ISWC 2020. And I'm very happy that Chris Mungall is here to give the keynote talk. In fact, we've been trying to get him to do a keynote for quite some time, but the problem was that kind of traveling to ISWC is always a bit away, and I think it's not on the list of conferences you go to every year. So I'm really happy we could make it possible this year. Now about Chris, and well, either you know him already, which is very likely, in which case I probably don't have to say too much. If you don't know him yet, you need to look him up. But just very briefly, so he's at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California, and Chris has been on the semantic web circuit before semantic web was actually a thing. I just looked it up. There is a 2001 paper on the gene ontology, highly cited, of course. And this was only one of the several big ontologies you have been involved in the past. So yeah, great you're here and can share some of your insights, from that long history of working in the field. And I will just leave it there. As I said, if you don't know him, look him up. And the many very visible papers he's written. I think, Chris, you accumulate in 3 years what, in terms of citations, what I accumulated a lifetime so far. So, all right. I'll leave the stage to the main person. Welcome, Chris, and I'll give you a brief reminder shortly before we should wrap.
Wonderful. Okay. Thanks so much for the very nice intro, Pascal. Yeah, I should say on the citation counts, it really benefits you if you were involved in some of the early genome projects, because that does wonders for your Google Scholar I-index and H-index and so on. So don't be too put too much faith in some of these metrics. But thank you, Annie, for the very nice intro. So today, yeah. And thanks again for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all, because design patterns are something like really kind of like key to a lot of what we do. And maybe some of what we do is, we're maybe dilettantes in some of these kind of areas, but what we've been trying to do is really kind of like take a lot of this work and try to apply it to not just individual ontologies, but really across all of the ontologies in the life sciences, and try and bring these things together. And really try and make something that works together as a single coherent whole. So that's the title of my talk: Aligning Design Patterns Across Multiple Ontologies in the Life Sciences. And so, if I can, just to set the scene, if you kind of, what we do maybe isn't so different from what you're doing kind of like outside the biological sciences. At the end of the day, kind of like maybe a bit like Amazon, we've got kind of a huge number of kind of like named entities that we want to manage and we want to categorize in some way. But I think we've got a few more named entities than even some of the big organizations like Amazon have. If you look at the broad categories of things that we care about, we care about like life on Earth, and there's something like 9 million different species on Earth. Each species has its own unique genome and its own complement of genes, like with roughly like 20,000 per species, at least as far as like multi-species or multicellular organisms are concerned. We also care a lot about things like drugs and chemical entities. There's about 10,000 different registered drugs, but on top of that, the space of chemicals goes into the order of something like trillions. So there's really a huge amount there. On top of this, we've got living organisms are built of cells. Cells can be categorized into many different cell types. They can be broken down into many different parts. There's potentially thousands, but maybe even many more than that. And one of the things I'll be talking about today is diseases and phenotypes and these are essentially kind of like the outward exhibition of characteristics of features in an individual organism governed in some way by your genetic code. And we've kind of like for each individual species, again, we've got something like up to 50,000 distinct phenotypes. On top of that, we've got like really a massive kind of like huge amount of raw data, exabyte, petabyte scale data. So there's many of these named entities, and there's many different ways to categorize them. So Pascal mentioned at the beginning the gene ontology, a project I've been involved in since near its inception. And we have about 45,000 different classes in our ontology, all for categorizing genes across different species. And so, you can categorize these genes using Go, but you can also categorize them using a number of other ontologies as well. The gene ontology will tell you about what the function of these genes are, what they evolved to do. But there are other ontologies that will tell you whereabouts in an organism these genes are expressed, what cell types, what parts of the body. Other ontologies will tell you what happens, what kind of diseases you will get if some of these genes are mutated. So there's a large number of ontologies just to be only for describing the genes themselves, never mind some of the other named entities out there. So it's quite a large task. Just to kind of show you roughly how, our kind of like central use case for many of these ontologies is that we essentially kind of like have some kind of core hierarchy, containing maybe kind of like subclass axioms, but also kind of maybe existential restrictions as well, such that we can break some kind of biological process, such as programmed cell death, into its constituent parts that are executed in order. And we can use these classes and these ontologies to annotate different genes. And biologists can use this to kind of like query over the genome. So if you're interested in any genes involved in the biological process of programmed cell death, the ontology can be used the hierarchy can be made to propagate genes up in your query to get back larger gene sets. So these, the concepts in these different ontologies, are frequently interrelated, even though we have maybe a different ontology for describing diseases, a different ontology for describing tissues and organs, a different one for describing cell types, a different one for describing chemical entities. Even though these are in different ontologies, the concepts are interrelated, and you can see this if you want to glean some kind of like bigger picture, some kind of multi-scale picture about a disease such as cirrhosis of the liver, which results in a large number of different phenotypes across the body. It can be like the origin site can be localized to a particular tissue, and then break that down into the biochemical pathways that are implicated and the individual chemical entities. So really we need some kind of like unified picture across these. But this is pretty hard when there's a pretty large number of ontologies out there. So this is this is a screenshot from the latest BioPortal site. So BioPortal does a fantastic job in aggregating all of the different possible ontologies that are in some way related or useful to biomedicine or the life sciences together. And the current count is almost like 900 different ontologies in BioPortal with 12 million classes in total. So it's quite a staggering amount. And if we're looking to do something as my group is doing, which is to really try and piece together some kind of grand ontological map of all of life. How do we go about assembling this picture from all of these 900 different kind of like ontologies out there? How can they be woven together to give us this bigger picture rather than being individual silos? Well, really, I think before you get into any of the technology, you really have to kind of like agree to sit around a table, real or virtual, and start really working together. And so to provide this framework for working together across these ontologies, a number of us, going back, probably almost like 2 decades now, decided to kind of like take what we're doing with the gene ontology and abstract it across multiple ontologies. And we came up with something called OBO, for Open Biological or Open Biomedical Ontologies. And the idea is that we agree to work together on a set of well-integrated modular ontologies. So this may be a subset of all of the ontologies, all of the 900 or so ontologies in BioPortal. These ontologies really agree to work together. And OBO also provides both the technical and the socio-technological framework for allowing this cooperation. So some of this is kind of like providing mailing lists and meetings and kind of like help for people. as well as actually the technological and infrastructural framework, tools, services, and so on for being able to build and meld together new ontologies. And all these things together, the overall aim is to kind of like build together this big map of life and use this to describe and curate all of the different named entities in the biosciences. And so you can find out more on the site, obofoundry.org. It's a screenshot. It's a pretty primitive looking site. It's very bare bones and functional. We don't have a lot of funding for this, but we do what we can with minimal technology. So here's a subset of ontologies on the left. In total, there's about 160 active ontologies within OBO. I would say these ontologies have varying degrees of commitment to the kind of like the overall mission, and they exhibit varying degrees of integration. The key thing to point out is this is not like a small team developing these 160 different ontologies. This is a very distributed, very diverse group, each with their own set of kind of distinct stakeholders, funding or lack of funding, driving them in a particular direction. There's millions of classes overall, and there's a huge variety of scope in here. So there's, one of my favorite ontologies that I work on is a cephalopod ontology for squid, octopus, and so on. But there's also very general purpose ontologies in there, such as KEBI, which is an ontology of chemical entities. So once we've really sort of like sat around the table and decided that we want to work together to build something, we actually have to go about and do this and figure out exactly what the framework is for connecting all of these different ontologies together. So if you kind of go back and look at the history, not much over kind of like 10 years ago, a lot of these original ontologies that were part of OBO, you could kind of like maybe question whether they were even ontologies in the strict sense of the term. They were really more like kind of SCOS terminological like artifacts. They had fairly simple axiomatization. They were really geared around kind of like lexical elements and kind of like simple hierarchies. So the gene ontology had simple edges connecting concepts like glucan biosynthesis to polysaccharide biosynthesis. And there was actually no linkage or connection to related concepts in our friends who were making a chemical entity ontology that had the actual chemical structures, such as glucan and polysaccharide. So this really represented a large, a big missed opportunity for kind of like working together in a modular fashion. So what happened? Well, to a large extent, we can thank OWL for coming to the rescue and providing both the standards and the tools that would allow us to take this more modular approach, and providing us the tools that we needed, the reasoner, the standard reasoners, and so on, to be able to kind of like connect things together and make inferences that leverage these different ontologies. So I want to kind of credit first of all, the core IDE within ontology development. Really, we couldn't do what we do without Protege. So again, this is one of the benefits of standards like OWL. You can build standard tooling such as Protege around it. We've actually kind of like developed our own tooling stack to complement some of this. Many of these are actually quite generic and go beyond kind of our own OBO and biosciences use cases. So you can potentially use these for your own ontologies. Our core kind of like flagship ontology processing tool is called Robot. It's a recursive acronym. It stands for Robot is an OBO tool. And it's a Java library, but really most people use it as a command line tool for operating on ontologies. And you can see the list of commands. There's a screenshot of the website here, but you can see a list of commands on the left. So this is really nice because it means you can, like, rather than having to fire up Protege and say run a reasoner and hit save, you can actually kind of like run these on the command line, and you can actually kind of like stitch the commands together in a workflow using kind of like makefiles or snake-make or a common workflow language or whatever your kind of like workflow system of choice is. We are super dependent on social coding, hosted version control systems like GitHub. We manage everything religiously. And something like Git, I want to give props to GitLab as well, but there's a certain kind of like network effect in using the same system. So we really religiously make sure that all our content is managed under version control, and we take advantage of the ability to do things such as pull requests to really make our kind of like system open, such that if you see something in one of your ontologies and you maybe you're not part of the core team, but you want to make, propose some kind of changes, you can come and use our issue tracker and you can propose changes there, or you can go ahead and fork the repository, make changes, make a pull request, and we can evaluate it. And we have kind of continuous integration jobs running using tools such as Robot to make sure that the changes that you propose are semantically coherent and adhere to our core standards. We also developed something called ODK, the Ontology Development Kit. And this is like a Docker container that really puts together a diverse set of different tools, including Robot. And one thing that we found that is really nice that allows you to do is essentially seed a new ontology project in GitHub from scratch. And so you can just run this, give it some parameters, and it'll set you up with a GitHub repository with a kind of like Travis set up already, with kind of like make files for being able to run a complete kind of ontology release process. And so we're really interested in seeing how well this kind of aligns with kind of like use cases outside the biosciences as well. So you can find out more about that on the GitHub site. But return to OWL as well, because OWL axiomatization and reasoning is really at the core of our modular approach to ontology building. So as I said before, ontologies like the Go used to be more SCOS-like, but then they actually gradually incorporated more and more axiomatization. And so we could actually, more formally define concepts such as polysaccharide biosynthesis or glucan biosynthesis, which are really just kind of like pathways for biochemical pathways for generating kind of molecules. And so we axiomatize this using the KEBI ontology, which is shown in green. And we can use kind of like what we call logical definitions, which are simply equivalence axioms between a name class and between some kind of like genus differentia type definitional structure, where we kind of essentially take a core concept in our own ontology, like biosynthesis, add a differentia using a different ontology, say polysaccharide biosynthesis is any biosynthesis that has output some polysaccharide molecule. And then one of the really nice things about this axiomatization, it allows us to leverage the work done in other ontologies. So just as if you're building software, you don't want to kind of like re-implement, mathematics library every time. You want to reuse that mathematics library. So we're doing an analogous thing in the Go, and that we're not experts in chemistry, but we're leveraging the work done in KEBI, the chemical ontology, where they've classified glucans as being polysaccharides. We don't have to do that ourselves. We just infer using OWL reasoning that glucan biosynthesis is a subclass of polysaccharide biosynthesis. Then using our kind of like robot-enabled pipelines, when we release the ontology, as far as our users are concerned, they just see this link between the two Go concepts, and they don't necessarily know that we built this using by leveraging this chemistry ontology. So we also built an ontology of object properties, essentially, the OBO Relation Ontology. This is really the glue that sticks together these different ontologies. So there's something like about 200 different object properties within RO right now. Some of these are very generic and can actually be used outside of biology, such as part of relationships. Others are a little bit more kind of specific to certain areas of biology, such as developmental relationships. So that we can say, something like the compound eye of an insect develops from a structure called the eye disc, and that each of these compound eyes has as many parts, these little ommatidia, which you can see as the little things in the diagram in the bottom left. And you can actually start linking across the different ontologies here. So you can say that the function of the different ommatidia are biological processes such as detection of light stimulus involved in visual perception, which comes from the gene ontology. All right, so far so good. So we have, we've got OWL axioms, we've got modularization. In theory, we should just be able to put these things together and start, building and linking ontologies, making the ontological map of life. But yeah, there are a number of challenges with working with OWL. And, I tend to kind of like view this simplistically as, within any one ontology, I see either frequent cases of under axiomatization. And we saw examples of that earlier in the previous versions of Go, where we maybe did not include equivalence axioms for our compositional concepts like glucan biosynthesis. But another perhaps more insidious problem is over axiomatization, where people tend to go, a little bit wild, using OWL and maybe not using it to the best effect. And the analogy I like to use here is an architectural style from the 18th century called Rococo. So, this picture here from Wikipedia really exemplifies the Rococo style. It's, as this description says, it's exceptionally ornate and theatrical, and it's got many little kind of like filigreed kind of features kind of twirling off, and it looks, all very nice. And it gives, essentially the illusion of kind of like motion and drama, and it's designed to impress an awe, maybe at the expense of, it's style over function, essentially. And Rococo ended in the revolution of 1789 with the bloody end of the political and economic system. So in some ways I kind of want to, bring an end to kind of like, what I see as kind of like Rococo OWL. So I picked one example that, is no longer in an existing ontology. I didn't want to kind of like, highlight any one particular kind of like, offender and so on. But to me, this is an example of something that is just maybe a little bit too ornate and doesn't really give you, a great deal of functionality. This was an early attempt to define a concept, the DNA extent, which is essentially kind of like a region of your DNA molecule in one of your cells. It's a kind of like a linear region of DNA that may have some kind of like genetic function. So it was defined, using this kind of like complex axiom here. You can see this uses Haspart, which notably is a transitive mereological relation. It uses this transitive relation in combination with a universal axiom, in combination with kind of like negation and union axioms. So, we're really kind of like, leveraging OWL to the max here. But the problem here is this is actually really, even if you maybe have a kind of like a perfect DL reasoner, it's actually really hard for humans to mentally reason over this structure and go, what exactly does this mean? And does it actually really mean what I think it means? And as you can see, when you combine transitives with universals and partonomic relations, you end up talking about either like, subatomic molecules as you go down the mereological hierarchy, or the entire universe as you go up. And this is usually not the intent of the person kind of like authoring some of these. So, a more general observation here is that we've got something of an expertise pyramid here. We've got like a huge number of like ontology users, and really to emphasize in the biontology world, this is like, there's a massive amount of users, many of whom aren't really even aware that they're always using ontologies. So the gene ontology has been, cited, kind of like, many thousands of times. It's used in hundreds of different tools. There's about like, 75,000 different papers that kind of cite usages of the gene ontology in interpreting biological data, interpreting the expression of genes and their functions. On top of that, we've got, a much smaller group of ontology developers. It's quite a small, closed community in the biosciences. We mostly know each other. But really, on top of that, there's an even smaller group of these ontology developers that I would actually say are kind of like OWL experts. And by OWL experts, I mean kind of going beyond just kind of like, the standard kind of like protege OWL tutorial, and it's really kind of like having a deeper understanding of kind of like, the models that you're building when you're kind of like creating T-box axioms. And, I think the reality of this pyramid is that we actually need to kind of like divide the labor a little bit differently. And really, we maybe need just a smaller group of people who are actually authoring OWL directly, but they can enable the developers by developing OWL templates, essentially kind of like what we were calling design pattern systems. And then the ontology developers essentially implement these, and they test their ontologies against the different design patterns. And the ontology users carry on consuming nice pre-reasoned hierarchies are not necessarily any any the wiser here. But in fact, maybe the ontology users, might actually find some of the design pattern abstractions as kind of useful ways of traversing these ontologies. So the system we came up to do this was called Dead Simple OWL Design Patterns. I want to say from the outset that maybe we did some of this naively. I think when we did this, it predated, or at least predated our awareness of it, and it probably predated our awareness of a lot of the things that you've been talking about in this conference. So apologies for our kind of naivety here, but we really just needed to kind of like build something that we could like use quickly and get up and running and use this practically in a number of different ontologies. So the system is called DOSDPs, Dead Simple OWL Design Patterns. The naming is a kind of homage to the kind of like OWL, where you invert two of the letters from web ontology language. One of the main developers here was called David Asumi Sutherland, so the name is kind of a homage to him and a homage to OWL. And really what it is a simple set of standards where we use a YAML encoding. And then based around that, we build a set of tools, the primary one of which is called DOSDP tools. And these tools allow us to essentially mass generate OWL axioms based on templates, both logical axioms and annotations. And we can do the reverse operation as well and match axioms in existing OWL ontologies to the templates such that we can take an ontology and say, well, how well does it conform to these design patterns? And we have some advanced tools for more experimental tools for actually inferring design patterns from ontologies. So to kind of give you a flavor of it, here is I'll take you through one of our YAML examples. This pattern is called import across membrane. It's a pattern for describing a particular kind of cellular process where gene products will essentially shuttle different kinds of chemicals across membranes within the cell. And so the kind of things that you care about here are location within the cell, the kind of cargo, and the location being transported to and transported from. So even though this is actually a biological example, I'm sure there must exist kind of analysis examples in kind of ontologies and transportation and so on. So it's really a similar kind of thing. So the first part of the YAML is we declare some kind of like some of the core classes that we're going to use. All of the URIs in our ontologies are semantic free URIs, so we give them nice human readable labels here. So membrane is the name for concept Go 16020 in the gene ontology. We also define some local names for our object properties as well. And we also define a set of variables within this template. So we've got 4 variables within this template. The membrane, the cargo being shuttled, and the start and the end location. And we can also specify kind of like ranges for these variables as well, such that the filler for the membrane variable has to be a subclass of membrane within the ontology. And I should say, of course, from the outset, these design patterns are primarily T-box design patterns. They are for generating classes and testing against classes within the ontology. Then we have the section that basically serves as a template, and this uses essentially kind of like standard kind of Python style string interpolation. And so here at the top we've got kind of the template for generating the name or the RDFS label. So the variables are listed in order of interpolation. We've also got a pattern for the definition annotation axiom, and most importantly, we've got an annotation for we've got a pattern for the equivalence axiom, and this will expand into a Manchester syntax expression. Where again, we have these variable fillers, and it's not showing all of them here, unfortunately. So what you can do with this then is you can actually feed in TSVs into the system, so that if you have a new class that you want to define, and you essentially kind of like fill in some of the variables. So the cargo here is a chemical called leucine. the membrane, it's being transported across the plasma membrane, and it's going from a location called the extracellular membrane to the inside of the cell, which is called the cytosol. And then you can run this through the DOSDP generate system, and it will generate both your annotations and your logical axioms within the ontology. Then, what happens after this is that you run the reasoner, and this new class that you've generated will be placed in the right place within the ontology, all through the magic of reasoning. So what's nice here is that curators who are maybe not experts in OWL, or indeed don't really know much about OWL or poetry at all, can basically kind of like give us a spreadsheet of classes that they need added into the ontology. They just kind of like fill in values in the spreadsheet, and boom, things get added, with all of the the naming and the axioms kind of added automatically. So we also developed something called a little bit more experimental, called the OWL patternizer. And the basic idea here was that we still have a large number of kind of like very simple kind of like SCOS-like ontologies. On top of that, we've got a large number of ontologies with kind of like what I think of as Wild West OWL axioms, where no one has explicitly decided to patternize those, but there's some kind of implicit pattern there, and it will examine these kind of implicit patterns and do various kind of statistical checks, and it will infer the design patterns in the ontology for you. So we've run this on about 72 different ontologies, both within and outside the OBO repository. The results are pretty variable. It's hard to give you an idea of accuracy because we don't really have a kind of a good gold standard here yet. But it is proven to be, massively pragmatically useful in that we've actually used this to seed design patterns for, a number of our ontologies. And as you saw, we've got about 160 different ontologies just within OBO. So this is proving to be quite useful. So I want to switch and talk about a particular design patterns effort called UPheno. And the story here is that how we use design patterns to unify multiple independently developed phenotype ontologies, ultimately for the benefit of patients of rare diseases. So the overall landscape that we started with here was a huge number of different databases. Some of these databases are biomedical or clinical, and they deal with data about humans. And some of these databases deal with kind of what are called model organisms. So organisms such as mice and kind of flies and worms and zebrafish that are used, that are studied in order to learn something about analogous systems within humans. Now, the problem here is all of these databases were developed independently. They all had their own independent vocabularies and ontologies for describing phenotypes within their system of interest. And they didn't really work well together, which is to the detriment of biomedical research, because we want to be able to translate knowledge about these model organisms to corresponding human systems. So we initially had an effort where we at least got these ontologies to use a very basic design pattern that we call the EQ pattern. This is essentially an entity attribute value pattern. And at the outset of this reconciliation project, it seemed like we were doing quite well. Of the 130,000 different phenotype classes across all these different ontologies, about half of them had some kind of like OWL definition, of which a decent subset followed this kind of like simple entity attribute value pattern. But the problem was people were defining what was essentially the same concept in radically different ways. So even though they were using on the surface some kind of like shared pattern system, the pattern system was so general purpose that it really didn't provide the level of unification that we needed. And this meant that we couldn't link concepts between, even between mouse and human, even if they were the same concept based on the OWL definition, because you can see from the Manchester syntax here, people, due to different perspectives, define these things in different ways using different modular ontologies. On top of this, different groups had different approaches in terms of pre versus post composition. So the mouse group, their database is called MGI, used a pre-composed phenotype ontology where concepts such as abnormal skin pigmentation had named classes with URIs within the ontology. But in contrast, the Zephin database used a post-compositional approach where they didn't actually have a named concept for something like abnormal skin pigmentation. Every time they encountered this phenotype in a fish, they would describe it by essentially kind of like, providing more atomic concepts from different ontologies, such as pigmentation and skin. And this, just led to kind of like increased problems in terms of like interoperating between these ontologies. So we and I should really kind of credit the leader of this effort, Nico Matonsoglu, who kind of like did a heroic effort in kind of like looking at all of these different ontologies, the way they'd been defined, seeding a set of kind of like core patterns. But key to this work was really a community effort led by Nico, where he brought together all of these different groups, with their different phenotype ontologies, through a series of workshops, through a series of kind of like follow-up calls, through working together in GitHub. He developed a kind of like a community process for devising and agreeing on design patterns for phenotypes. So this is kind of shown in this flow on the left here. So one of the curators would maybe say, we need a new pattern for describing a phenotype where we want to represent it in terms of like an aberrant biological process that's happening in a particular location in the body. So we take this to the pattern workshop. There'd maybe be some discussion on GitHub about it. We'd iterate a few times, and then it would go into production. We'd use it to build this kind of like unified ontology called UPheno, and then once all of the community members had rated this as finished, it would go and it would be an agreed upon pattern in the final ontology. And this is actually really relevant because the resulting work gets used in existing tooling, including tooling that is being delivered to patients in the clinic. So this is a tool that we developed as part of a project I'm on called the Monarch Initiative. The tool is called Axiomizer. And the basic idea here is that if you have a patient who is suffering from some rare genetic disease, and you want to know what the causative gene in that disease is, well, you can sequence that patient, but that still doesn't necessarily kind of like narrow in on what the causative gene is as well. So what you want to do is leverage existing prior knowledge in the form of phenotype ontologies, not just human phenotype ontologies, but phenotype ontologies for other model organisms as well, and use this to inform your prediction of what the causative gene is. This tool is actually being deployed in clinical settings. It is actually being used to diagnose kids with rare diseases. It's used in projects like Genomics England, and it has actually led to actionable results where once parents learn what the underlying genetic cause is in their disease, they can actually in many cases take action to kind of like mitigate the effects of this disease. So this is a really nice example of kind of like design patterns, having like real world implications.
And we should be coming to a close relatively soon.
Perfect. Yeah, I just want to kind of like make a few kind of closing remarks here. And one, is a few observations, and maybe some of these are already kind of obvious to you, but I'm kind of slowly coming around to them. And one is that the way that we're using these kind of design pattern template frameworks is we're kind of essentially defining meta classes in a way, where the classes, the OWL classes that we're making are the things in our domain of discourse. So really what we're talking about here is a kind of meta class framework. And then what I'm increasingly seeing is more and more overlap between across different projects I work on, where we've got people doing kind of like, some classic kind of closed world style data modeling, and maybe they're using, framework, object-oriented frameworks like UML. In some projects, we've started to use shapes languages like SHEX. And some of this actually reminds me of back in the day, back pre-OWL, when we had kind of like frame languages as well. So I'm seeing kind of increasing overlap between our use cases here, and really just towards thinking in terms of kind of like, what we're actually doing here in some ways is OWL modeling with classes in the domain of discourse. And what I would like to see here is really just kind of like more, more kind of like unification, not just amongst the different pattern language frameworks, but really unification at a kind of like a higher level of formalism. And as I see it, this all comes down to kind of like, modeling and design at some level. And rather than having this kind of fragmented landscape where we've got just so many different kind of like, design frameworks, even within the semantic world, we've got Shex versus Shackle, but outside the semantic world, you've got, UML, JSON schema, all over the rest of it. So, yeah, and maybe this is naive, but I would really love to see just, one kind of like overarching framework that kind of like combined the best of design pattern frameworks, UML-like frameworks, shape frameworks, and kind of open world OWL modeling. And so we actually have a modeling language that we've developed called BioLink ML. It's a multimodal language, and we've primarily used it for data modeling. It compiles to JSON schema. It's of JSON LD compliant JSON schema to Shex to Python data classes, and we're kind of tentatively exploring adding templating support in there. So I'd be really kind of curious to your thoughts as to how wise this all is. And so really just to kind of like bring a few messages home, just to really kind of like emphasize again, the OBO project, we're really bringing together multiple independent ontologies developed by different groups, trying to bring these together into a single cohesive modular framework. This is a long-term task. We're still, a long way from kind of like achieving this, but we've seen huge successes in certain sub areas, such as the phenotype ontologies here. And really, I want to kind of like credit just the whole concept of design patterns with being essential to what we're doing and to making the success stories work here. So and in addition to just the technical framework itself, I really want to emphasize how much it's not just about coming up with a perfect kind of like format or tools, but really you need kind of cooperation and shared agreement between these different groups in order to have success, at least in something like the OBO world. And we still lack a lot of kind of like key tooling here, and there's a number of different kind of like formalisms, and I know we're partly responsible for creating like yet one more, but I'd love to see more work in terms of like more tooling and more unification across these different formalisms. I'd be really keen to kind of like hear either after this or offline some of your thoughts on this. So finally, just to give you a few links here, I'll make these slides available so you don't have to memorize these GitHub links, but most of what you need can be found via the OBO Foundry website. I want to give a plug to my blog as well, where I kind of like write various kind of like rambling musings on some of these kinds of issues. And to finally thank all of the people involved, a huge number of people involved in OBO, but particularly in the DOSDP work. I want to credit kind of David Asumi-Sutherland, who came up with the framework, Jim Balhoff, who writes the DOSDP tools, and Nico, who writes ODK, and has kind of like really deployed this framework across multiple different ontologies. So big credit to all of those. And finally, also, I want to say we are hiring at the moment. So if you're interested in semantic technology applied to the life sciences, find me and send me an email or message me somehow. And with that, I will stop, and we can move on to discussion, or I can take any questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very appreciated. And as always, and as we've talked about for years, still on my radar to try to make more connections between the different approaches to modularization. I also know Martin Skeveland is on board, is in the call as well. So he's been working on Otter, which I think is also related. So yeah. But I don't want to steal the show. So we had a couple of people in the chat asking questions. Recording's still on, so if you're okay asking it now, I'll go in the list in which I received them. So Kogan, you would be the first.
Hi, so this is Kogan. I just had one question. I wasn't sure if you mentioned in your talk, but like how frequently do new ontologies get added to OBO these days?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers offhand, but I'd guess it's something like kind of one every couple of weeks or something like that. But maybe to emphasize, what we tend to see is the ontologies that come in now tend to be very kind of like leafy in the kind of like the OWL import graph. So it's a very specialized ontology that will leverage existing ontologies in a particular domain. We tend not to see newer ontologies, dedicated to some core area like chemistry or cell types and so on. So, yeah, I think, I would guess like, about kind of like 20 or so a year or something like that.
It's pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm.
As just sort of a follow-up to that is when you receive these new ontologies, how are they evaluated with respect to the rest of the Foundry?
This is okay. I could do an entire kind of presentation on this, but yeah, it's ongoing. It's not great at the moment, so we have quite an ad hoc process for just admitting them into what we call the registry. They have to at least be open, and they have to at least be relevant and within scope, and not something that completely duplicates an existing effort. But we are working on our kind of criteria for initial inclusion into it. We have something called the OBO dashboard that will execute a series of kind of like standardized checks. So we say, as well as just kind of standard things like, is your ontology semantically coherent? It will also say, does it follow our naming conventions? Does it have a sufficient number of textual definitions? For example, using kind of our preferred annotation properties. So I can paste a link to the dashboard for you. So basically, stay tuned for more on the evaluation, and we're really interested in everyone's thoughts here in terms of ontology evaluation, because I know there's a lot of overlap.
Awesome, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot. Juan, you want to go next?
Oh, maybe we can read his question.
Okay, so he essentially said, very glad to see the peer review process to extend the ontology and design patterns and using GitHub. Do you have that documented, lessons learned, a case study paper, something like that?
We're planning a paper on the ODK, the Ontology Development Kit. Right now, there's scattered kind of like presentations, blog articles, and so on that are linked from the ODK repo. So I think that would probably be the best place to start for that kind of thing. And some of these presentations just talk about our kind of like history of going from, a very kind of like, ad hoc way of kind of like managing the ontologies to, a series of kind of like, essentially we've got kind of essentially design patterns for working with an ontology in GitHub. It's like, use a separate file for your source version from your kind of compiled version for the release. Run these kinds of processes on it, and so there's a large number of lessons learned that have been distilled into the ODK templates. Mm.
Thanks, Deborah. You want to comment? You put one in the chat.
Just that I really applaud this direction, and I think we as a community, or I'll just speak for myself, I also am really interested in trying to support interoperability among ontologies and among tooling, and I'm willing to help and collaborate, and I just wanted to support the directions you're going.
Excellent. Consider yourself a collaborator. We'll be in touch. Thanks.
Cool.
With everyone, and you in particular, your experience would be most welcome here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, it may make sense to try rally the troops there. And yeah.
Oh, and actually, while I still have the mic, I had to join late, so I'm hoping that there's a recording and Pascal will post it.
There will be, yes.
And I'll send you the slides as well, and you can publish them too. So.
Perfect.
Excellent. Martin, you want to go?
I had two questions, and one is, what is the role of naming and labels in your ontologies? My notion is that you often use more like cryptic identifiers in your domain, and in other domains, for instance, in the layman domains I'm working on, it's extremely critical how we name things, because more precision for experts often leads to worse data quality when you go down your pyramid of experts.
That's right. Yeah, we use semantics-free kind of a numeric URIs such as a Perl with OBO library geo _ number, and the idea is that the labels can change over time. But if the concept remains the same, then we retain the same ID. And we have a whole identifier policy. And we are working on kind of naming conventions. There is actually a whole paper on OBO naming conventions by Daniel Schober. So we've incorporated some of these in OBO. But there is a tension between precision and kind of domain scientist-friendly language, because sometimes there'll be a kind of concept that a particular community of scientists will see as being unambiguous for one particular concept, but yet another community will use that same label in a different way. So there's always this tension between providing something that is kind of precise, which can sometimes be a little bit alienating. It sounds very ontological sometimes if you have a very long wordy label. So it's a compromise. We also try and include kind of like a richer set of lexical synonyms as possible, and sometimes we tag those synonyms and say, if you're from community X, you may prefer to use this synonym over the kind of like the preferred label.
Okay, and the second rather short question, what do you think about the role of UML class diagrams for communicating an ontology? And if you think they're useful, how do you generate them? I saw that the BioLink ML has a link to some tools, but is there an automated way of generating them, and are you using those?
So I'd say at the moment we're not using those at all, because a lot of people in our kind of community don't think in terms of like classic kind of OO modeling. But I think there is a huge role for whether it's like UML diagrams specifically or just kind of classic kind of OO cell diagrams for communicating these kind of like meta classes essentially. What we've been doing so far is that we've essentially been kind of like inferring kind of like hierarchies of design patterns, but I think we're going to have to kind of maybe change that approach somewhat and really actually start thinking of at least our design pattern framework as something more in the line of something like UML and actually using UML diagrams. And I think actually some of the non-computational scientists, ontology developers would actually really welcome seeing the kind of overarching design for their ontology as UML type diagrams.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Sharfer had a question, but his mic isn't working. When developing biological ontologies, what do you feel needs to be better than what we currently have? In particular, asking about theoretical limitations of description logics, or is it more about software tools, or what is it?
Well, yeah, I could probably again do another entire talk on that. I mean, so I actually tend to find that a lot for the actual T-box itself, I'm quite satisfied with even just like, the EL subset of OWL. But when we try and build, what is now being more trendily kind of called like knowledge graphs, where you actually want to go beyond just the kind of like the terminological T-box and actually start relating, trying to describe in detail how the genes in one of my cells kind of work together to achieve a biological process. Then you start to get into territory that is, well, maybe even classic first order logic is not the ideal framework here. Maybe there's aspects of modal logic here, and actually there's aspects of kind of like, probabilistic modeling. So I think that's a really big kind of open question when it comes to the bigger picture of actually how we use the ontologies as part of a larger knowledge model. But just for the kind of ontologies and T-boxes themselves, I just think we need more. It's mostly a resource problem. There's so many gaps in these ontologies. There's a lack of kind of like OWL expertise in many of these ontologies, and even people, we're even kind of resource limited in terms of like kind of making new design patterns for these ontologies to kind of like help them. So it's primarily a resource issue.
Thanks. Hang Dong, do you want to go next?
Hi, many thanks for your talk. I'm pretty interested in the rare disease project you mentioned. Any resources, ontologies that you put together that on this project, and also the gene prioritization related to that?
So a lot of this is kind of like comes from a project that I'm a PI called the Monarch Initiative Project. So I pasted a link there. You can find more information there. But the flagship ontology there is HPO, the Human Phenotype Ontology. I mentioned in my talk the way in which we have shared design patterns across the human phenotype ontology and the mouse one and the fish one and the fly one and the yeast one. But really the core flagship one there is the human phenotype ontology. And the tool is called Axiomatization. But you can find more details on the Monarch Initiative website, or you can just email me offline as well.
Yeah, many thanks.
Chris Kinderman?
Yeah, hi. Thanks again for your talk. It was very, very interesting. I was just wondering whether there's any endeavor where you try to collect all your ontology design patterns, whether they are these that simple design patterns or of any other kind in some kind of public catalog where you explain how they are interrelated and how they can be used in combination, for example.
Yes, we'd love to do that. I'm kind of obsessive about kind of metadata for ontologies. So, I didn't have much time to go into like the kind of the OBO Foundry, but we have a very primitive website that is basically kind of GitHub pages that are driven by simple kind of, again, YAML files that are actually YAML LD files that have kind of like metadata fields for each ontology. And it's just, finding the time someone has to go and kind of extend that schema, and we'll add the tag in there and say, this is where you find the design patterns for this ontology. And then we can have tools that will aggregate those together and have a nice website where we can show them all together and how they all relate, and it'll be lovely, but we've just not had time to do that yet.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much.
So last question, Martin Skeveland.
Yes, hi Chris. I'm wondering if you have any tools to maintain or structure sets of patterns. So, reason over sets of patterns in order to find overlaps or redundancies and so on.
Nope, and we're really only just discovering the actual need to do that ourselves. So we do something quite primitive at the moment where we take a pattern and we kind of like fill in all the variables with the most generic class possible. And then we kind of create an OWL class from that, and we just use standard OWL reasoning to figure out the relationships that way. But it's a bit problematic for reasons I can't go into, but it's for time. But yeah, there's different assumptions with kind of open world and closed world reasoning there. But I'm finding increasingly I need to be able to say things like, this pattern is disjoint with this one. And you should, if you see any class that conforms to both these patterns, something has kind of gone wrong somewhere. But we don't actually have that within our framework yet. So I think there's a real need for it, and we don't have it yet. So.
Can I have a follow-up on?
Yeah.
Do you think is there any expressivity missing, do you think, in dead simple ontology patterns?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And it was really just an attempt to kind of like get us something kind of simple and up and running, and with the view that something is kind of like better than nothing. But I think we're now at the stage where we're kind of like taking stock and saying, okay, well, if we could extend this, what would we do better? Or maybe if there's some kind of like, system that we need to kind of like jump to from this one, and maybe now is the times, and that may be Otter. And I know David and Nico have done more than I have in terms of like kind of like looking at Otter. I should also mention there's another system that we use within Robot, a robot templating system. So even within OBO, we've got different systems for doing this. So I think now is a good time for kind of like thinking about what the successor to this system might be.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everybody, and thanks Chris. Thanks for as always, you're bringing a richness of quality work to the discussion, and there's of course many more connections to be worked out, and I hope that we'll have opportunities to do that in the future. Thank you very much.
Good. Mm-hmm.
And Lou, we could stop the recording.